Ladies and gentlemen, the child who grew up too fast is often praised in public and bleeding in private. People call them mature, wise, strong, responsible, but psychology calls it something deeper, a nervous system that had to become an adult before it was ready. This is not just a sad story, it is a blueprint that shapes identity, relationships, self-worth, and the way a person survives the world. Because when a child grows up too fast, they don't just lose childhood, they often lose the belief that they are allowed to be cared for. When a child grows up too fast, the world often applauds what is actually a survival adaptation. People say, "You're so mature, you're so responsible, you're wise for your age," and the child learns to wear that label like armor. But inside that maturity is rarely peace. It is often pressure. It is the nervous system learning that childhood is not safe, that being carefree is not allowed, that someone has to hold the weight, and somehow, that someone became them. This kind of early maturity usually forms in environments where the child cannot fully rely on adults for consistent protection or emotional stability. Sometimes the adults are loving but overwhelmed, working too much, struggling financially, battling illness, trauma, addiction, or depression. Sometimes the adults are unpredictable, critical, explosive, or emotionally absent. Sometimes the household is chaotic, with conflict, instability, or responsibilities far beyond what a child should carry. In those conditions, the child's brain does not ask, "What do I deserve?" The child's brain asks, "What will keep me safe?" And the answer often becomes, "Be easy, be helpful, don't need too much, don't make things worse." So the child becomes useful. They become the one who does not complain. They become the one who helps with siblings, chores, paperwork, emotional support. They become the one who behaves perfectly in public so the family looks fine. They become the one who learns to soothe adults, not because they want to, but because it reduces conflict. And once a child discovers that being responsible calms the house, responsibility becomes a survival strategy, not a personality trait, a survival strategy. This is why the praise becomes dangerous. Praise rewards the survival behavior and turns it into identity. The child starts believing, "My value is my usefulness. My love is earned by how much I carry. If I relax, something will fall apart. If I need comfort, I'm a problem." And that belief follows them into adulthood like a silent contract. They keep over-functioning, not because they enjoy it, but because it feels like the only way to stay worthy, safe, and loved. The tragedy is that the adult world often mistakes this child's control for strength. A child who is quiet and responsible is easier for adults, easier for teachers, easier for family systems, because they don't demand attention. They don't create problems. They don't act out. But psychology knows that children have needs, and when those needs are suppressed, they don't disappear, they go underground. They reappear later as anxiety, perfectionism, people-pleasing, emotional numbness, or the inability to rest without guilt. One of the clearest signs that this maturity is survival, not health, is the emotional cost. The child may look calm, but inside they are tense. They may look composed, but they are scanning for danger. They may look independent, but it is an independence built on necessity, not freedom. They may seem wise, but that wisdom often came from pain, from watching adults struggle, from learning things a child should not have to learn so early. This is why many people who grew up too fast feel older than their age, even as children and later as adults. They sometimes feel emotionally younger in the areas where they never got support. They can handle crises, but struggle with softness. They can carry responsibility, but struggle with asking for help. They can manage everyone else's needs, but struggle to name their own. Another deep layer is the loss of play. Childhood play is not just entertainment. It is how the brain learns safety, creativity, and emotional flexibility. When a child grows up too fast, play becomes rare, because the mind is busy with responsibility. The child may feel guilty doing nothing, guilty laughing, guilty resting, guilty enjoying. They may feel like joy is irresponsible. And later in life, they may crave joy but not know how to allow it, because their nervous system learned that joy is a distraction from duty. This keynote is ultimately about a painful misunderstanding. The world praises the child for being mature. But what the world is really praising is a child who learned to ignore their own needs. That is not maturity, that is self-abandonment. Real maturity is not a child acting like an adult. Real maturity is an adult who can meet their needs without shame, set boundaries, ask for support, and still stay responsible. A child who grows up too fast didn't choose maturity, they chose survival. And healing begins when that person stops trying to be the strong one at all costs and starts giving themselves what they were denied: permission to be human, permission to need, permission to rest, permission to be cared for. When a child grows up too fast, the nervous system often becomes a surveillance system. They learn to read the room the way other kids learn to play. They study tone, footsteps, silence, facial expressions, and micro changes in energy, because in their world, mood shifts are not just moods, they can be danger. This is hypervigilance, not simply overthinking, but a body-level habit of staying alert, because the past taught them that relaxed equals exposed. Hypervigilance usually forms when the environment is unpredictable. Maybe a parent's love was inconsistent, warm one day, distant the next. Maybe conflict could explode without warning. Maybe alcohol, depression, financial stress, or trauma made adults emotionally unstable. Maybe the child was blamed for problems they didn't cause. In that kind of home, the brain adapts by becoming a predictor. The child tries to sense what's coming before it arrives, because predicting danger gives the illusion of control. If you can anticipate the storm, you can prepare, you can become smaller, quieter, helpful. You can prevent the explosion, or at least avoid being in its path. This is where the child becomes a mood reader. They can tell who is upset without a word being spoken. They can tell when tension is building. They can tell when someone is about to criticize, or when a parent needs comfort, or when an argument is coming. It may look like emotional intelligence, and in some ways it is, but it is not a relaxed emotional intelligence. It is an anxious one. It is born from fear, not curiosity. It is used for safety, not connection. And when a child spends years practicing this, it becomes automatic. As an adult, they may still scan rooms, still interpret silence as threat, still feel responsible for the emotional temperature, even in safe environments. At the same time, many of these children experience parentification, the child taking on adult responsibilities too early. Parentification can be practical, caring for siblings, cooking, cleaning, translating for adults, managing tasks. It can also be emotional, becoming the therapist for a parent, the peacekeeper between adults, the one who absorbs complaints, the one who comforts, the one who listens to problems that a child has no business carrying. This is not helping out. This is role reversal. The child stops being cared for and becomes the caretaker. When a child is parentified, they learn that their purpose is to stabilize others. They learn that love is earned by being needed. They learn that their feelings are less important than everyone else's. They become the responsible one, the mediator, the fixer, the one who prevents chaos. And they often become good at it, because survival depends on it. But what they lose is the experience of being held. They lose the right to be messy. They lose the freedom to be a child with normal needs. Hypervigilance and parentification often feed each other. Hypervigilance helps the child detect emotional danger early. Parentification pushes the child to manage that danger, to calm the adult, to soothe the sibling, to fix the situation. So the child becomes both the alarm system and the firefighter. They sense the smoke, then rush to put out the fire. Over time, their nervous system becomes addicted to crisis management, because crisis management feels familiar. Even when things are calm, they may feel uneasy. Calm can feel suspicious, like something bad is coming. That is one of the cruelest effects of growing up too fast. Peace can feel unsafe because chaos is what the body knows. As adults, these patterns often show up in relationships. They may choose partners who are emotionally intense or unstable, because their nervous system recognizes the dynamic. They may become the one who overfunctions, the one who fixes, the one who explains, the one who carries. They may struggle to receive care, because receiving feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel unsafe. They may feel guilty when they are not helping. They may struggle with boundaries because boundaries feel like being selfish. They might even feel responsible for other people's moods, as if someone else's sadness or anger is their fault to solve. These patterns also show up internally. Hypervigilant adults can struggle with sleep because the body doesn't fully switch off. They can struggle with anxiety because the brain is trained to search for what could go wrong. They can struggle with relaxation because relaxation feels like losing control. They might be highly competent at work, highly dependable, highly composed, but inside they're tired in a deep way, not just physically, but emotionally, because carrying everyone else's emotional world for years creates chronic stress. The beginning of healing is learning to separate responsibility from rescue. Responsibility means, I can care. Rescue means, I must fix. A child who grew up too fast learned rescue. They learned, if I don't manage this, things fall apart. As an adult, they have to relearn, I can be supportive without becoming responsible for someone else's emotions. They have to teach their nervous system that calm is allowed, that silence is not always danger, that conflict is not always catastrophe, that their worth is not tied to being the stabilizer. They have to practice boundaries without guilt and rest without fear, because their body needs a new lesson. You are not responsible for holding the whole world together to deserve love. A child who grew up too fast often becomes the emotional caretaker of adults around them, a role they are forced into far too early. This phenomenon is called parentification, where the child assumes responsibilities that are far beyond their age. They take on the emotional needs of parents, siblings, or other family members because the environment demands it. In homes where one or both parents are emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or overwhelmed, the child quickly learns that love is earned through usefulness. The child's value is not based on receiving care, but on how much they can give. They become the peacemaker, the emotional anchor, the mediator, the one who makes sure everything runs smoothly while internalizing that their own emotional needs are secondary, often pushed aside altogether. As a result, the child develops a sense of responsibility for the emotional well-being of others at the expense of their own. They may comfort a crying parent, shield a sibling from conflict, or absorb tension without understanding how it affects them. This role teaches the child that their worth lies in how much they can help others, and it becomes deeply ingrained in their sense of self. The child who grows up too fast also learns to suppress their own needs and emotions. They may suppress feelings of sadness, anger, or frustration, believing that expressing these emotions will create more problems or lead to rejection. Instead of asking for help, they bottle things up, keeping their struggles private because vulnerability is seen as weakness. Over time, this emotional suppression can become automatic, as the child learns that their feelings are less important than maintaining peace and stability for others. They become hyper, aware of the emotional climate around them, sensing when others are upset or need comfort, but rarely acknowledging their own pain. This dynamic can carry into adulthood, where they may struggle to express their own needs in relationships, feeling that their emotional expression will disrupt others. The long-term impact is emotional numbness and difficulty connecting with their own feelings, making it harder for them to experience deep emotional intimacy with others. They may also struggle with anxiety, depression, or feelings of disconnection, because their emotional world has been neglected for so long. The child who grew up too fast often learns to develop a strong sense of resilience, but this resilience comes at a cost. They become incredibly capable of handling adversity, managing responsibilities, and enduring stress. They learn that when things go wrong, they must be the one to step up, to take charge, to fix things. This resilience is a survival mechanism, born out of necessity, because they learned early on that their emotional and physical well-being depended on how much they could handle. They carry this resilience into adulthood, often succeeding in their professional lives and taking on multiple responsibilities with ease. However, this strength can also become a mask, hiding the emotional toll it takes on them. They may feel proud of their ability to manage chaos, but inside, they are exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. They may have difficulty asking for help, feeling that relying on others makes them weak or burdensome. They may also find it hard to relax or take breaks, because they've been conditioned to believe that rest is a luxury they don't deserve. Over time, this can lead to burnout, chronic stress, and a sense of emotional emptiness, as they become so focused on taking care of everything else that they forget to care for themselves. The resilience that once served them can eventually feel like a heavy burden, a constant reminder that they are always expected to keep going, even when they are running on empty. A child who grows up too fast often develops an intense sense of self-reliance that can be both a strength and a psychological burden. From an early age, they learn that relying on others is risky, unreliable, or even dangerous, so they teach themselves to depend on no one. The psychological foundation for this self-reliance is rooted in survival. If they can't rely on adults for emotional or physical support, they learn to fend for themselves. They become highly independent, often excelling at solving problems on their own, taking care of themselves, and not asking for help. However, this self-reliance often becomes a double-edged sword, As they mature, their reluctance to ask for help or admit vulnerability can turn into emotional isolation. The more they manage on their own, the more they internalize the belief that needing others is a weakness, and that seeking support is a form of failure. This mindset prevents them from connecting deeply with others in adulthood, because they have learned to see self-sufficiency as a necessary form of strength, rather than a collaborative and flexible choice. This sense of emotional isolation can leave them feeling disconnected, even when surrounded by people, because they never learn to lean on others for emotional support in a healthy way. Alongside this self-reliance is a deep internalized pressure to perform and overachieve. As a child, they often feel that if they don't act mature, responsible, or perfect, they risk creating chaos or disappointment for others. The feeling of being the strong one becomes embedded in their psyche. They learn that receiving praise and approval means being the person who can handle anything, manage crises, and deal with problems with ease. This mindset is reinforced by external feedback. Parents, teachers, and others often commend them for their maturity and capability, which further reinforces the belief that their value lies in their ability to be functional, even when they are struggling inside. Over time, this leads to an overachievement complex, where they push themselves relentlessly to prove their worth. They take on more than they can handle, fear failure intensely, and rarely feel satisfied with their own accomplishments. Because the goalposts are always shifting, no matter how much they do, they always believe they should be doing more, and often feel that their worth is tied to their ability to succeed and perform, rather than their inherent value as a person. The psychological toll of growing up too fast also manifests in emotional suppression. As a child, they learn to mask their own emotions because they have witnessed that expressing vulnerability or neediness creates emotional discomfort or even rejection. Whether it's because a parent couldn't handle their own emotions, or because the child learned that adult-like strength meant pushing down personal feelings, they often grow into adults who have difficulty expressing themselves emotionally. Suppressing emotions becomes an automatic habit, and their inner world becomes a place where sadness, anger, or even joy is rarely given voice. They may feel emotionally detached or numb, unable to access their feelings fully, which causes them to struggle with emotional intimacy in relationships. They may be uncomfortable with deep emotional connections because they were never allowed to experience them as children. Over time, this leads to chronic emotional disconnection, where they feel like they are merely going through the motions of life, unable to connect with their own heart, let alone share it with others. They might also project a "I'm fine" mentality, even when they're struggling, because vulnerability feels like an unsolvable problem. Lastly, the child who grows up too fast often experiences a loss of childhood and carries a deep-seated grief for what was never allowed: joy, play, rest, and freedom from adult responsibilities. These children often miss out on the carefree experiences of being a child, where they can experience playfulness, imagination, and emotional exploration without fear of judgment or consequence. Because they were required to grow up so quickly, they may feel that their childhood was stolen or that they had to act like an adult long before they were ready. This loss of childhood becomes a silent, unprocessed grief, often ignored or minimized because the person never learned to mourn it properly. Later in life, they may carry a sense of longing for something they never got, a desire to feel the lightness of childhood again, but without understanding how to reconnect with it. This leads to internal conflict, because they may want to experience joy and freedom, but feel trapped by the serious, responsible role they have carried since childhood. Their longing for play, fun, and freedom can lead to a profound sense of emptiness, as they search for ways to reclaim something they lost in their formative years, not realizing that healing requires learning to integrate those lost parts of themselves, and learning that they are allowed to rest, feel, and be human.